I'm pretty sure that makes 9 of us, so somebody's gonna have to sit out. Any volunteers?
Giant?
Hook. You stay. I go. No following.
All right, so you're recording then, Ryan?
Yeah, I am.
Great, then we can just get started. Welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I am here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, the Iron Giant of the Bun Magic Kitchen Table Pro Tour Maddox.
I don't understand.
You ever see the movie Iron Giant?
Right. It's because I'm big and made of metal. Now I remember. Yeah, that makes sense.
No,
hey, how you doing, Andy?
No, it's because last night you sacrificed yourself so we could have a full pot of 8. You said, no, you stay. I go. And where you went was to go play BattleBox with somebody who was new to Magic
They were
completely?
pretty new. They made some, basic sequencing errors, but they were like, you know what? No, I'm not looking for advice. Let's just play the game. And I feel
that's
like
great.
they picked some things up. They learned some things, and we had a couple good games. But, that's one of the sacrifices we got to make. We've talked about growing the local play group, and sometimes you just have a weird number. And if you want to see, we had some other new people also joining us.
That's true. We did, yeah.
And it was definitely a bigger priority to have them be able to cube, and hopefully they'll be coming back soon.
I was talking to a friend of the show, Zach Barash, about trying to just get better at playing Cube in general, and he was just pointing out, like, from everything I've heard about you all, like, your whole vibe is to try and, like, be as welcoming as possible, and that's kind of counter to, like, getting as good as possible at this thing, because sometimes you have to step out of the pod, and you're going to be playing with players of all different skill levels, because you don't want to kick someone away because they are a scrub. So,
The Bun Magic Kitchen Table Pro Tour, scrubs are welcome.
Scrubs edition. Yeah, you're welcome here if you're a scrub. But we have someone with us on this episode, Anthony, who is decidedly not a scrub. We are joined by Ryan Parnell Slayer Saxe. What's up, Ryan?
Hey, how's it going?
It's good. I'm really glad somebody could put Justin in his place, because he doesn't need any more reason to be self-confident, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, though. I was scared. I thought that was not a good matchup, so I'm glad that I was able to roll over him.
Yeah, he seemed to think that Sling Gang Lieutenant just kind of like carried the whole day, and I guess that's just for chump blocking, basically. I was surprised that he was so afraid of Sling Gang Lieutenant in your deck.
Yeah, so, I mean, we talked about this a little. I think that Sling Gang Lieutenant is unbeatable for him unless he has a trample creature. So the main problem is basically if I have Sling Gang Lieutenant, I can reprioritize the way that I cast my spells to make sure that I'm saving my removal spells for the trample creatures, and that could even mean like casting double shock or whatever on them to handle them, because usually that gives me enough time to just eventually deal 20 without engaging in combat. That's at least how the game's played out.
Did you not have to? So we're talking about the rotisserie draft that we talked about with Justin Parnell last week. I had to deal with a Sling Gang Lieutenant, and it felt very punishing and unbeatable. Did you not face that, Andy?
I did. I faced it on like the very last turn of the game, basically, where I just sort of lucked ahead of things, and Ryan pulled Sling Gang, and it bought him a whole other turn, which was valuable. But yeah, I guess it's not much of a problem for my deck. I had a lot of flyers, which is my form of evasion, so I wasn't as worried about chump blockers on the ground. But yeah, congratulations, Ryan, on your win. It was great to watch somebody so skilled navigate the cube. You really put on a clinic.
Thanks. Yeah, it was fun. I got to also play one of my favorite. I love the sacrifice decks. They make my brain hurt, but I love them.
Yeah, I mean, the sequencing that you were doing of just like you're saying, not only the sequencing of just how do you get stuff into play and into your graveyard at the right time, but also sequencing based on all the different threats that your opponent could have is, yeah, I mean, like Andy said, it was really cool to see that. And like, definitely you're playing at a level that we scrubs are not.
We do our best. We're trying.
We do our best.
We're trying to grow every single day. We have you on the show this week, Ryan, because we are talking about what you and Anthony both identify as cube designers that have a special affinity for like limited style Magic, which I think we're going to maybe get into what that means, but that's what we're here to talk about. I thought maybe we could start with this, though. So I have seen people before describe Cube as somewhere on the continuum between limited and constructed, or like a hybrid of the two. Does that description make sense to you, Ryan? And if so, which do you think like Cube broadly is more closer to, like limited or constructed?
I understand where people are coming from when they say that. When they say that, like, in Constructed, your decks, like, do a thing often, and you're really, a deck itself may not have a linear plan, but you're kind of trying to, like, linearize how do you put this? Like, you're trying to really maximize a strategy in a Constructed deck in a way that you don't in Limited. In Limited, even your aggro decks, even your control decks, they all need to be able to play different roles of the game. And in Constructed, you can kind of ignore that. And in Cube, in some ways, you are drafting a deck in which you do get to ignore different aspects of the game in a way that you don't in Limited. You can draft a true control deck in most Cubes. You can draft, like, decks that are more resemblant to the play patterns of Constructed, but I don't really see it as a continuum between the two. I think that Limited is a way of building decks in itself. I think that, this is a really hard question that I haven't actually thought about.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like from my perspective, I think a lot of that comes from really limited resources, which at least one of the first places that I was exposed to really thinking strategically about Cube. And I think part of a couple points they make there, one of them is just that you're playing with cards that you are potentially familiar with from Constructed. So I feel like that adds a lot to the vibe, where it's not just, here's a bunch of 2/3s otherwise you wouldn't see, but it's like, here's Snapcaster Mage, this and you love it from Modern. Here's Jace the Mind Sculptor, or, here's specific patterns of cards, like the whole Splinter Twin package is like a deck that in a lot of Cubes, at least at that time, you'd often see, and that gave it a very Constructed vibe. And I think it was also very different in the sense that how they described it as being different is that you weren't just drafting sort of based around a bunch of heuristics trying to optimize for having a reasonable curve, having a good balance of interaction versus threats, but really you were trying to draft decks that had a plan and were trying to do the one thing in the same way that you're describing you can do in Constructed. So those I feel like were the ways that they were trying to maybe not put it on a spectrum, but at least put it as a thing in between that shares aspects of both traditional Limited with sealed packs and Constructed.
Yeah, I see it. I do. There's just something about the description that bothers me, and I really can't put my finger on it.
It bothers me too, honestly. I mean, it bothers me because I think it narrows what Limited can be. Like, to me, Cube is just Limited, right? It's Limited with different cards. It's the same spirit of the format. And just like there's differences between any two Constructed or retail Limited sets, there's differences from Cube to Cube, and they can all play kind of differently. I think there are environments, like retail Limited environments, where you are drafting with much more of a plan. Like, your deck is way more synergistic, and you're not just drafting a good curve with, like, reasonable creatures and hoping it's going to win the day. And conversely, there are some Limited formats that are all about that, right? Like core sets or whatever, where it's just, that's what you're doing. You're drafting like a bread and butter deck, creature deck. So I always felt like that description just came from the fact that your deck was more powerful, and people were like, well, Constructed's more powerful than Limited. But to me, I think the compromise is the thing that you touched on, Ryan, that really strikes me. Like, Constructed decks are uncompromising. You have your big card pool, you make your deck exactly what you want it to be. You don't have to compromise anywhere if you don't want. I mean, we could define the word compromise, but like, you get to choose your entire pool in draft. The very nature of any kind of draft is that your deck is going to be somewhat compromised. You're going to have not the ideal cards you wanted. You're going to have to try and kind of fill in the gaps and be creative in certain places. And that, to me, is what makes it Limited more than something like Constructed.
Well, it's pretty rare for me to engage with someone about like a conversation in Limited where they can put to words something that I didn't. I 100% agree with what you said. So
I'm curious to know then, seeing as you two both describe yourselves as lovers of Limited, trying to build cubes in the spirit of Limited, what does Limited mean to you? Like, what does that mean? How does that actually distinguish you from other cubes that are out there?
So to me, Limited, right, there's the main component of my enjoyment of Limited is the drafting portion. Unlike a lot of people, although maybe like many others, I would be super happy to draft Play No Games draft again and just like throw back drafts. The way that I see games are actually as a function to get better at drafting. So I like to play the games in order to learn more about a specific cube or a specific Limited format, see what's good so that I can draft better, because that's the part that I really enjoy. And to me, the fun of Limited is really in navigating the path from like, there is nothing in front of you to there is a cohesive and strong deck. I think that is incredibly fun and something that I haven't really been able to replicate in other games or really anything other than Magic.
I don't think you're alone in enjoying the draft more than the games. I think a lot of players are in that same seat. I've always thought it'd be fun to do some sort of heads-up draft with somebody, some two-player format, and then afterwards look at your decks, and if you agree on who would win, then you just draft again. But if you disagree, you play out the games to see who's right and who's wrong. Just like, if we both agree that, you drafted a better deck, then there's no reason for us to play these games. Let's just go on and draft again. But I totally agree. I think that the draft it's the part where there's like a bunch of opportunity and ambition and like endless possibility that is like slowly unfolding before you. And then you get to the games and it's like, all right, well now it's like the rubber hits the road and the things you were hoping might come together might not in the games or whatever. And I think it's definitely like a difference of how big you're thinking from a design perspective versus just wanting to like make optimal plays. And in the Roto Draft, we had this conversation with other players and some people were like, I would never dream of skipping the games. That's what Magic is all about for me. I draft this deck and then I test my skill by seeing how good it is and trying to play it optimally. And other people were like, no, I mean, the drafting that's what's fun about Limited. So I think you're not alone in that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll never forget a friend of ours in our local play group when Arena first came out and they had the bot drafting. They were like, oh man, they got this all backwards. I just want to do the drafts with real people and then just, set up an auto battler to figure out who wins the games. But the drafts are really the fun part. Having the bots for that part made no sense to them.
And when will they have bot games?
Exactly.
I'd pay for that. I'd pay a lot of money for that.
But yeah, I mean, I feel like especially among Cube designers or Cube players, that is definitely a big part of it. Because if you just wanted to play games where you had exact full control over your deck and things like that, you could just play Constructed. But it is the sort of scrapping against limited resources and the struggling against not necessarily having control over everything. And how do you make the right compromises in the choices in your draft? That is really where a lot of the satisfaction comes from. For me, it's maybe 50-50, but I definitely think about the draft when I'm constructing cubes and when I'm playing as much as I think about the actual games.
What is your definition of limited, Anthony? When you say you're a lover of limited Magic and the regular cube is a cube for lovers of limited, what does that mean to you?
I mean, I think the two big things are sort of that sort of tension of not just sitting down and thinking, here's all of Magic, I'm going to build my deck from it, or, this large card pool. It is trying to navigate how do I construct the best deck through this challenging process, and how am I going to pit my evaluation of cards against other players to try and build the best deck. And the Rotisserie Draft really, really highlights that, where, we are playing these games of chicken about how am I comparing my evaluations of cards to other players. And the other thing that I think is huge about Limited is just the variety, the fact that you're not saying, I'm going to build this one deck, I'm going to build it optimally, and then play the same deck again and again. It's going to come together a little bit different every time. And when I was playing a lot of Limited, not a lot compared to you, Ryan, but for what was me, a lot of Magic, a lot of Limited, it was really fun to sort of explore a format and see how there was sort of this level one, here's how you explore the different color pairs, and then maybe there's some sort of hidden decks that are built around one key common that doesn't necessarily shine normally, but if you put it in the right context, if you build around it, it does something pretty special.
Slitherblade and Amonkhet or whatever.
Sure, Slitherblade, or I remember one particular, the must be blocked creature from Dominaria that you could compare with like a first strike cantrip, and
Warlord's Fury. For what it's worth, I put that one on the map.
Yeah, that was you. I actually remember that. I think, yeah.
There was like a point I was streaming. I posted it on Reddit. I went like 3-0 with a deck with like 4 of that 4/2 and like 5 of the first strike cantrips.
That's pretty disgusting.
Yeah, and that's just super, super cool to see. The other thing that I think is really, really big for me about Limited is definitely just that the gameplay is different. I feel like a lot of Limited formats are much more focused on playing to the board, curving out well, a lot of just sort of combat-focused heuristics, and not so much on, here's these 2 cards, you combine them in a certain way, and now you win the game. And to me, that's what I really like about cubes that I play more is I don't love environments where it's like you get this card A and as long as you open up card B and you put them together, you get this combo and you win. It's
How many
more
times
about
have you actually played a cube with those kind of combos?
Not a lot, and I'm happier for it because it's not fun to me to just sort of like roll the dice and be like, well, either I get past the second part of this combo or not. And obviously there's a lot more sophistication to building a deck that can actually, optimize around a combo for sure. But I do really enjoy the experience of just making those minor adjustments of saying, well, I have this card. This gets a little bit better every time I draft something in this category, but it's not unplayable. It's still a functional card, and it's about trying to optimize how do I make these many complicated relationships of cards work best together.
Yeah, I mean, so there is one thing where I think I'm a little bit different, and where a lot of my inspirations from Limited to cube design in particular is what I'd call like perturbations of archetypes, right? As you said at the beginning, in Limited, you draft blue-white twice. Your deck is never the exact same. And, you know, there's like a normal distribution around what your deck probably looks like. Maybe in that format, for the most part, blue-white is going to be flyers. But based on what you've drafted, you can go down a variety of different paths. And for me, what I try and do when designing Cube, and this goes all the way up to like vintage Cube level power. This is not something that you miss out on at a higher power level, but it is certainly... you can argue it's less relevant. It is, how do you create an environment where you give your players a lot of agency to do different things within the same archetype? And where I differ with respect to what you said is actually in those A plus B combos. For me, one of the things that I find very interesting is the way that, you know, blue-red control is drafted differently when you have twin and when you don't. And how it, not as like a dedicated combo deck, but as like a control deck that has both of those pieces, and how you draft differently simply because you did take a twin or a Pestermite early on, and you might not get the piece, but you'll still have a fully functional blue-red control deck at the end of the draft, whether or not you get it. But how you navigate that towards different axes of a particular archetype is one of the parts of drafting cubes that I find the most fun. You can do a lot more with it, arguably, when the cards aren't as powerful as it is in Vintage Cube, but I do think in Vintage Cube there's plenty of single cards, few little packages that you can do that give your players a lot of different ways to express themselves through the same, let's call it a macro strategy.
I think one of the things that's cool about Twin specifically is that it's also a combo that has lots of different potential pieces in different colors, right? Like, I've seen people play Village Bellringer and Restoration Angel as the other half of the combo, or even like Great Oak Guardian, which is a green 6-drop, but also goes infinite with Twin. Like, stuff that means that that deck doesn't just look like one thing, right? It's not that the Splinter Twin deck is so linear that you just draft the same deck. It's that here's a weird combination of cards that you can kind of slot into any deck that changes the texture of it. It's at least why I think people enjoy playing with it. I have never actually built it in any of the cubes of my own.
Yeah, I do really appreciate that term you used of perturbations of archetypes, and I think that really makes a lot of sense and translates to the fact that it feels somewhat negative when you're drafting. It's like, well, I'm trying to draft this blue-white flyers deck, but I didn't quite get enough reach here, but I, maybe picked up a couple black removal spells, so I'll try and compensate by splashing some of those. And so it is sort of like, because of the luck of the way the draft works out, you end up getting forced in different directions that maybe you didn't expect to, which I think calling it a perturbation is really cool.
I wonder how this idea compares to a distinction I have in my head, which I didn't originally associate at all with like an idea of retail limited, but my regular cube, which is not called regular cube, it's called the Blood Magic Cube.
Your primary cube.
Just to confuse people more. You're like, there's a big food court in Baltimore, Ryan, called R House, like the letter R House, which is the worst because you're like, do you want to get food? Sure, where? Let's go to our house. Oh, your house? Where is your house? It's like, no, our house. It's like a who's on first thing. I feel like that's what the regular cube has done. It's like, it's a who's on first of cube names.
Exactly, yeah.
Yep.
Either way, my cube, the Bun Magic Cube, is, as I describe it, aiming to kind of optimize what I consider to be fair magic. And I consider a fair deck to be anything that cares about tempo and value and like has to operate on that axis and cares about what its opponent is doing on that axis as well. You have to like have this interaction with those sort of two knobs between you and your opponent to navigate the game state. And when I designed the Degenerate Micro Cube, which is a very different kind of cube, and in some ways like one of the extremes of a combo-oriented environment, I think those ideas of tempo and value are just completely null and void. Like, I don't really think any like idea of tempo that describes a regular Magic game is completely out the window. Value is not a thing, basically. Like, Ancestral Recall is an okay card in that cube. It is not even a super high pick because 3 cards is not that much better than 1 unless they're the right cards. That cube is all about the cards. It's about how the cards in your deck line up against the cards in your opponent's deck. Do you have the right answer to my threat at the time that you need it, or do you have a way to deal with X, or do I have a way to deal with your threat? And that to me is almost what I consider to be like definitional of a combo environment. It's like, it doesn't really matter if your opponent is aggressive or mid-rangey. It matters, do you have the spell that will stop my Storm deck, or do you have the spell that will break up my Splinter Twin combo? And maybe there's like that extreme. Does that also describe something similar on this continuum or this distinction that you're getting at?
Yeah, so I mean, if we're using like terms from limited formats, generally I would call that the rules of engagement. Any limited set, and this is the case for any cube, has certain rules of engagement that aren't actually, I mean, the designer can try and push them in a certain way, but it's kind of the way that the meta falls. If you are doing, X and that is not within the rules of engagement, you are going to lose. Right. Similarly, if I draft the turbo cube and I try and play creatures and attack my opponent, I imagine I'm going to 0-3 almost every single game, at least from what I've heard about that cube, because I haven't played it. And part of that has to do with, based on the way that the rules work there, the rules of engagement say that's not the axis that you need to play on. There have been plenty of limited formats with different types of rules of engagement. The most classic is aggressive formats. Very, very aggressive formats say, hey, you're just going to lose if you try and play a deck that is, not curving out. Even your controlling or late game decks, your plan needs to be like curving 1, 2, 3 anyways, even for the point of blocking. And, part of understanding how to optimally draft any cube is understanding the rules of engagement of that format. Classically, in Vintage Cube, this is one of those things that, like, if you're not planning on doing something busted, you need to be planning on killing your opponent quickly, is generally a way of describing the rules of engagement of Vintage Cube. Because the fact of the matter is people have mocks and people have these crazy powerful cards. You're not going to win games by just, like, casting random spells that are good. You will, as long as you're, like, they're the utmost best cards. You're talking about your Okos, your, what's this, Boo?
Minskin Boo.
Whatever that, Minskin Boo, like these kind of new ridiculous mid-range cards. Sure, you can play mid-range by casting them, but you really need to be planning on killing your opponent quickly, whether that is through actual combat and aggression or doing something busted. And that busted thing can still be like a control deck that is going to win by like casting like a mana drain and something like that. But you're not going to win games by just casting magic cards like you normally would.
And if you are going to win games that way, is that what we get at? Is that a way to describe a environment that plays like limited? Or are you saying there are limited environments where the rules of engagement are so different that they don't operate on the like just curve out, have a decent deck axis?
Right. So my point is that limited is a much broader space than people really think about. I think a lot of people would describe limited as, if they had to use a sentence, they'd say something like every deck is a form of mid-range. It's a classic
I've definitely heard that before,
people have said over and over and over again. And the reason they say it comes from a good place, which is that generally speaking in limited, no matter what your deck is doing, you need to be able to play any role, because your decks aren't optimally built like constructed decks, and sometimes you're not going to have a 2-drop on 2, and your aggressive deck that doesn't have a 2-drop on 2 needs to
Is
be
it really an aggressive
to,
deck anymore?
Yeah, I mean, it needs to be able to play as if it wasn't, right? You need to, a big part of limited is that whole assessment of who's the beatdown, and a big reason why is because even your control decks are going to be on the play and curve out sometimes, and even your aggressive decks are going to be on the draw and stumble. But that doesn't mean that every deck is actually a form of a mid-range deck. In particular, I think it's where a lot of people make mistakes in limited, and why I find limited cubes really exciting is related to this. Often, I will see people put cards in their deck that don't belong in their deck in limited because they help it, they help shore up different roles, right? They help saying, okay, like, I need to have some cards that are good from behind in my aggressive deck because sometimes I'm going to be behind. And, usually what I say is, you need to know how to play from behind, and your deck, sure, you're going to have to cast spells from behind sometimes, but it's much better to just include cards that continue to push your advantage when you're ahead, because then you're just going to be behind less, because you're going to continue to push your advantage as if you're ahead. So you do need to actually push towards different extremes of different axes in limited, and different formats have, as I said, different rules of engagement for it. There are formats, like Amonkhet is a really good example when you mentioned Slitherblade, where there was no mid-range or control in that format. It was just aggro mirrors.
Just Hooded Brawler and Gust Walker back and forth.
Yeah, but a lot of people didn't take that next step of if it's aggro mirrors, what does that mean? everybody was like, okay, it's aggro mirrors, so it's 2 ships passing in the night. But if you think about Constructed, in Constructed, often aggro mirrors turn into these really long mid-range or slugfests. And so Amonkhet is the format that I won, I think, the most at. I think in my last 100 matches of Amonkhet, I won 86 of them.
It's a very good record.
That's insane.
Yeah, it's probably the best I've done in any limited format. And part of it was because I was actually focusing on blocking. I was focusing on the aggro mirror and how do you build your aggressive deck so that you can assert yourself as the beatdown, but your cards are less invalidated when you're behind because you're so likely to be playing against aggressive decks as well. Anyways, I think that's way aside from the cube discussion. Mostly what I mean to say about cube is this idea of designing in a limited space is a lot more than just designing low-powered mid-range fests, which is what I think a lot of people think of. In particular, a lot of people in the cube community, probably the closest thing that they've experienced to, cubes that are supposed to be like limited, they think lower power, they think Pauper. And classically, that's kind of what Pauper Cube is, right? Pauper Cube is kind of this mid-range fest where you're playing all of your Phyrexian Ragers that you possibly can get your hands on.
Yeah. I still remember my first ever draft of like the Pauper Cube that somebody else had owned. I went and played it at a local game store. And I just remember my opponent playing, I think it was 4 different Gravedigger variants in one game. And I was like, is that what this cube is? Just play every Gravedigger imaginable, every 4-mana 2/2 or 5-mana, 1/3 that gets back a creature from your graveyard and just grind it out. And I definitely think there are a lot of rarity-limited environments that do play that way.
Yep. And so for me, actually, the number one thing that I focus on when designing a lowered powered cube is how do I make it not that? Because generally what's going to happen if you take all of your favorite cards from different limited formats in a lower powered setting, you're going to end up with a rules of engagement of your format being take a Muldrifter, pass everything else.
Yeah,
for sure. And that's one of the things that I think I really enjoy about exploring this sort of lower powered space is there are a lot of ways to push against that because unlike just playing a Pauper Cube and only playing uncommons, which have really specific design restrictions, there aren't a lot of cards printed at uncommon that interact with multiple targets at once or, it like dealing with 2-for-1s is basically what uncommons are all about. So being able to or being willing to just splash in a couple rares here and there that just change sort of the axis of the game, give you some powerful build-arounds, just create an opportunity for decks to exist that don't fall right into those rules of engagement of just being around 2-for-1s.
I feel so stupid that it never occurred to me, but of course that's a part of how they design cards in packs. They don't put 2-for-1s that are like reactive at common because that would be miserable in a retail limited environment, and that's why your Pauper Cubes end up being so much about the 6-mana cards that draw 2 cards because that's just better when there's no way for you to like recoup that card advantage any other way.
Right.
Yeah, and this actually pushes you to exactly the one thing I wanted to make sure when I came that we touched on. And this is the fact that a flat power level isn't necessarily a good thing. Now,
speak on that.
People can love, flat power level cubes. I personally think flat power level makes more sense the higher in power you go.
Which is ironic because the higher in power level, it's also harder to make it actually flat at that point, right? Because
correct.
The higher you go, the fewer cards you can possibly, compete on that same axis.
Oko and Minskin even if we're ignoring power, like what's the 348 cards that are similar to that or whatever?
Yeah.
Yeah. The main reason though is that and this is why you see Pauper Cubes being like this massive mid-range fest where the only thing that possibly matters is Muldrifters for the most part, is that, when you're in a low power setting, that is what your best cards are, right? And if you exclude them all, right, then you end up with this like weird space where you can't really get card advantage. And I've played in that space of like I designed a combat cube, which was really cool, but the idea was not about combat tricks. The idea behind this cube is how do you solve the Muldrifter problem? What if you made it such that the only way to gain card advantage was through the combat step? So you couldn't cast a card. You could like cast the cards that drew cards, but if you're like playing a creature, that creature's an Ophidian, not a Muldrifter, and that turned out to be hard to balance for other reasons due to snowballing. Like it's really hard to come back from behind in that kind of cube. But anyways, with respect to the conversation of a flat power level, one of the great things about limited is, this common, uncommon, and rare that leads to this unbalance of power level distribution across your deck where you have some power outliers. Now, the best limited formats, all of the best rares are beatable. All of the best uncommons are beatable. These aren't like hopelessly better than anything else that you could do. But the important thing is that the meat and potatoes that you're building your deck with, they're not mull drifters. They're commons. And so when I'm designing any cube that is at the lower power level, I usually don't do rarity restricted cubes. What I'm trying to do is limit the amount of cards that would be otherwise rare or uncommon in power level so that this mull drifter problem doesn't happen. Right? As long as you can have them, but as long as there aren't too many, then the optimal strategy can't be for everyone to draft all of them because there aren't enough of them. And so you figure out what the glue of your cube should be. Maybe you have, like my build around cube as an example, which is, I think higher power level than most would describe from a limited type, environment, but it is still what I would call low power. Is kind of like there's a big graveyard theme, and so a large portion of this cube is me focusing on what is the glue for all of the synergies, all of the different things that you can do, where that glue is not just raw card advantage. Maybe it's card advantage if you jump through some hoops, but importantly, that glue makes up the majority of the cube, and it is not card advantage.
So you're basically looking at this big chunk of your cube and saying these are effectively the commons of my environment, even though there is no rarity, right? You're not seeding packs or anything. You're just saying this is what's most present in the cube, and so being conscious of card advantage at that level and making those cards play like the spirit of commons as they're designed today, whatever rarity symbol they actually have, is how you kind of mitigate that.
Exactly. And the fact of the matter is, right, when you say common, you do it a little bit of a disservice in the sense that, I was saying the word common too, in the sense that common comes with this like lower powered baggage, right? This idea that like, oh, it's like, kind of scrappy. And they don't have to be. You could have there are a lot of quote unquote commons in my build around cube that are actually rares, right? And they can be really powerful cards. But the point is as the designer, you exert some amount of control over the density of an effect that you want in your environment. And as long as you make certain things not too dense, it becomes impossible for the environment to devolve into whatever that thing is that isn't dense. And in my case, for most of these, what I would call limited power level cubes, and that is a very wide range, to be very clear. The point of that is usually restricting the ways that you can get card advantage. Card advantage is very important, but it is the easiest way for a metagame to what I would call collapse, which is what you view for most pauper cubes. In fact, I'm not saying, I know I've been kind of crapping on pauper cubes here. I'm sure someone somewhere has designed a pauper cube that doesn't have this problem, but personally, I've drafted maybe 15 or so pauper cubes in my life, different ones, and I have never found one that doesn't have this problem as long as that cube's goal is to try and push to the upper limits of the pauper environment.
I have played one pauper cube that I think didn't behave like this at all. It's a listener to the show who's got the handle internet in a lot of places. I've played his pauper cube, and he, I think, is also very conscious of this problem and explicitly just avoided any of those cards that give you those 2-for-1s. And to your point, Ryan, it's like, okay, well, I'm choosing not to play what are in many ways the best cards at this power level, right? I'm not power optimizing anymore. But then you end up with a different kind of metagame, right? Where the cube is much more aggressive, where maybe a mull drifter is maybe not even that good anymore because you've chosen so many cards that are fighting on a different axis that by avoiding them so strongly, you've created a different sort of meta. So yeah, I think it definitely is possible. My whole thing with rarity restricted cubes is that I've never been able to like fully, I don't love just power optimizing, right? Like the idea of I'm just going to play the most powerful cards and see where that leads me. I like to design cubes. I want to have influence over the thing that I'm actually designing instead of just kind of doing whatever Wizards happens to print at the highest power level. And whenever I hear about a rarity restricted cube, I'm just like, if you're calling it a rarity restricted cube, I feel like in some ways you must be power maxing, right? Because otherwise you would just play an uncommon or a rare that happened to fit your design goals. Like, why wouldn't you? And I feel like that's why I kind of roll up against the idea of like a harsh rarity restriction. It's like, you're probably just trying to play the most powerful commons, right? And you're limiting yourself because you don't have the self-control to not jam a bunch of powerful uncommons if you let yourself do it. But if you just actually take a step back from that and say, what are your actual goals, and exclude all those cards that are too powerful to meet those goals. I mean, some of those cards are commons too in some cases, right? Like some of the common cards can be big power outliers regardless.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a funny thing to me when people talk about rarity-restricted cubes. I mean, I think you're right. It is just a way to say, like, well, okay, we've done the vintage cube. We've played the most powerful cards in Magic. Let's choose a different set of boundaries in order to do something different.
Yeah,
I think
it stems from the like cube building as deck building idea, where it's like we built the vintage cube, which was the biggest, best deck in all of Magic, and we just cut bad cards and added good cards until we ended up at whatever our idea of a vintage cube is. And then you take that exact same mentality and apply it to a different card pool, and then you have a different kind of cube. But it's the same mentality, right? It's the mentality of cut bad cards, put in good cards, see what happens. And to your point, Ryan, what happens, I think, at common power levels is very often just draft every 2-for-1 you see and hope you draw them in the right combination to beat your opponent, who also drafted every 2-for-1 they saw.
Yeah, I mean, related to this, if I'm looking specifically at your build-around cube, I like this idea of things that take some investment. They take some work to get your 2-for-1. So it's not just about, I'm going to draft Muldrifter, it's always going to do the Muldrifter thing. Instead, you have Thought Monitor or Bizarre Trade Mage, these cards which can still generate card advantage, but you need to actually support them and draft around them. And I think that almost sort of in an artificial way, without actually having this idea of rarity, creates that effective rarity where you're just not going to be able to build a deck that can really optimize Thought Monitor every time. So when it can, it's still giving you that little bit of novel experience of, now I have the deck that this can work with, but in an average deck maybe it's still going to be a C- or whatever. I mean, is that a way that you think about sort of creating that kind of artificial rarity?
Yeah, so I mean, well, so in terms of like my build around cube, I don't know how much we want to talk about the specific cube. I do have like a rare slot to begin with, to like have cards that are like quote unquote at the same, they show up at the same kind of probability as a rare and retail limited, but outside of that, you're kind of spot on, right? The idea, this is actually another thing that I find really interesting about Cube that I'll start with an aside. You know how like it's very common to say you only get to play like 23 of your cards, so that's why lands are high picks, right?
Yep.
Right, it's like a thing that, gets said a million times in every Cube forum. Like, you teach someone to draft Cube, you say, take the lands higher. It's not exactly like retail limited. Any retail limited format, too, that has a bunch of lands, everyone's like, take it higher because you get to play more of your picks. Something that nobody talks about that is true to how I draft in Limited, and also very true to how I draft Cubes, is you can actually kind of make a similar argument to hedge picks and pivots. At the end of the day, you're going to end up with enough playables at the end. And so speculating on a card like Thought Monitor that can be an A+ in your deck if you get there, but if you know how to draft and you can draft really well to understand when you're not going to get there and start navigating differently and still end up with a good deck, to me, those picks are actually of similar value as lands. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily make my deck, but I view it as like I get to take like a coin flip to getting an insane deck here. And that costs me one pick. Maybe I lose that coin flip and it's up to me as the drafter to recognize when I've lost that coin flip to make sure that I still end up with a fantastic deck at the end of the draft. But it takes one pick to give me that coin flip.
I totally agree, and we did a whole episode about I think we called it using the other half of your cube, and we talked a lot about lands as one way that you can sort of make more of the cards work in the draft. But another big thing we talked about was these sort of build-arounds or more narrow cards that just aren't going to be relevant all the time, so you can use that extra space during the draft to make these more committal and speculative picks, which, I think it just adds a lot more variety and interest to a draft.
I think Ryan's right, though, in bringing up that I never hear that talked about from the drafter's perspective, right? Like, we talked about it from the cube designer's perspective, right?
True, yeah.
Like, your drafters are only going to get to play 23 non-land cards they draft, so you've got all these other cards they're going to draft. What do you do with that space? And what we talked about was giving them options of cards that won't come together every draft. But the idea that, the way you're describing it is I think, perfect, Ryan, where, like, okay, if I take this card that maybe right now is not that great in my deck, but could be really cracked if I get the right things in later packs, maybe you're saying, okay, I'm giving up a C+ to take this card that might be a D and it might be an A, and there's a 30% chance of it being an A by my evaluation. Then you're like making this calculation for that 30% chance to be an A is going to pull up my overall draft by enough on average that it's worth making that trade-off right now and just speculating on that card. I love that perspective. I think that's a great way to look at it, and a much more like concrete way to describe the value of a speculative pick rather than just saying like, I'll take it, maybe it'll come together, which is, I think, how you most
that's
often
the
see it
heuristic that I
described.
usually follow. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's a few things going on there too. So the one thing that is true about draft that's really interesting is when you're drafting, the pool of cards that you have available to yourself is more than the cards right in front of you. You kind of touched on it a little bit there, but you could think about it as everything that you will have the opportunity to pick in the future is in your pool.
Right.
Right? So when you take a card, part of that is evaluating what is the likelihood that I will have the opportunity to make this card great. And to me, a big mistake I see a lot of people make in Cube is really strongly gravitate towards these kind of tried and true, I'll take this card that's kind of good in any deck, or this generic removal spell. And if you end up with just a bunch of generically good cards in your deck, sure, that's going to be fine. But that's never going to beat the deck that got the crazy thing and was able to make that payoff. And the fact of the matter is, my opinion at least, is usually when you miss on those payoffs, your deck isn't that much below, what the generic good pile of cards is. It'll be below it, but it's not going to be as below it as you would be above it if you hit. And so I'm a big fan of just going for payoffs. And to tie it back to my build around cube, a big motivation of my build around cube is trying to just how can I build a reasonable environment such that every single pack is going to ask you that question. You don't necessarily need to go for it, but every pack is going to have cards that can be that A. If you navigate properly and you get the right pieces, and it falls on the drafter to figure out there's probably a path down this draft in which my deck is absolutely cracked, but I don't know which path I'm supposed to take or how to take it, but there is one. And that's something that I find really fun.
And that's why you love drafting a million times. It would just, put your deck away and then draft again, because navigating that decision tree is what's so rewarding to you, right?
Yeah, I made the cube for me, very, very particularly. Someone was trying to give me some feedback at one point. Actually, Zach Barish, who, great, I think you mentioned him already. He's great cube designer, great game designer, great person. And he was giving me a lot of feedback. And I realized one of the big reasons why the feedback that he was giving me on the build around cube wasn't resonant was I told him, hey, let me realign you for a minute. I am the consumer of this cube. I am building this cube for me, and other people will draft it with me. So, tailor your feedback such that, even though it's probably not true, assume that everyone sitting down at the table is 8 copies of me, that they know the list very well, that they're an expert drafter, all of those things. And since then, all of the feedback has been kind of spot on. But anyways, that's a funny aside.
Yeah, I mean, it's a useful aside, though, because we always talk about the context and the audience is super, super critical. And I'm looking at this, and honestly, this looks a lot about like a cube that I'm sort of working on. But one of the big differences is I am building it for this audience that we've talked about that has pretty mixed skill levels and experience with the game. So definitely having not everything be all in this super next level, see the whole tree
Galaxy
of possibilities all at once, have some easier inroads, have some more flexibility, have things that are not necessarily cards that are really, really difficult to parse, but have have a lot of the strategic complexity be hidden. And that's all sort of baked into or based off of just the actual goals and audience that you have, which is really important for any kind of design project.
Yeah. And I think it also makes a lot more sense. I would say, generally speaking, when we're talking about these limited power level cubes, if you think about what limited is, it's actually designed, importantly, to be consumable by a much wider audience.
For sure.
Just because I know we are going to get the question, Ryan, you mentioned that you have this category of cards in your cube that you consider the glue that holds everything together, and that's where you're explicitly trying to limit card advantage and make sure that it's not just free 2-for-1s and whatnot. Do you have a rough sense of what that breakdown is? What percentage of the cube is glue versus what percentage of the cube are these more ambitious, build around, cards that have a high reward if you're able to do whatever they ask of you?
Yeah, I would guess I'm going to just split to those build around kind of cards and glue, even though there's a lot of stuff in the middle.
I'm sure it's all hard to categorize anything really strongly.
Whatever.
Yeah,
I would guess it's probably 80% glue. Would be my guess, a very large portion of it. But to be very clear, I think a really good example of this is cards I consider glue here are like Faithless Looting, Careful Study, Frantic Search.
Right.
Right? Because they're generically good cards, but like they're not actually like Careful Study, if you're not doing anything with it, is not actually a very good Magic card.
Card disadvantage, baby. You're down a card.
Like it's right. But it's not that hard to make them much better. So it becomes pretty easy to build decks that have kind of this redundant component in this glue and figure out which build-arounds, which like micro archetype is that going to, sit best with. Ends up being like one of the bigger questions of how you draft that cube. But I would guess it's probably about 80%. If it's less than 80%, I should probably increase it. And this is another one of the reasons why, at least for the way that I design this cube, I think the rare slot is so important, because it helps me inject variance with kind of more crazy and narrow build-arounds without risking so many dead cards and so many build-arounds in the base cube, what we would say, right? Like the glue needs to be such a high density of the environment, because otherwise you have a risk that people aren't going to be able to like piece together good decks at the end. And that's no fun if people's decks aren't good. So that glue component needs to be a lot of it. And one of the big struggles I had when I was designing this at first is like, the ways that I was building the cube, the glue was so much of it that I felt like I didn't have any room to actually add all the build-arounds that I wanted, which is where that rare slot kind of came in.
I feel like you've been on a very similar journey, Anthony, with your irregular cube, which I know you've had like...
And we should clarify, irregular. This is different from my primary
We have
cube.
multiple listeners that learned only when we streamed it that you actually had two different cubes, because the names are so similar that they sound identical when you say them aloud.
Look, it's not supposed to be functional. It's a dumb joke just for me. It's
Okay,
a series of dumb jokes.
The audience of your cube names is just for you. As long as we define it that way, they're perfect
Exactly.
cube names. I know you've fallen in and out of love with that cube. It's been a little bit, back and forth with how you feel about it. I wanted to note that we played it on stream, I guess 2 weeks ago at this point, and I thought it was interesting that one of the hallmarks of that cube, right, is that you have this rare slot, the way that Ryan's describing, where some number of these cards are shuffled in. And it sounds like you have very similar ideological approaches to that rare slot, where it's like some power outliers, but a lot of it's just build-arounds, right? It's not necessarily the most powerful card. It's like, this is not a card I want here every draft. I don't want to fill up my packs with all of these narrow build-arounds. Instead, I'll just give you a little smattering of some of them, and maybe they work out, maybe they don't. I would assume that given the presence of some power outliers and some cards that have the potential to be power outliers if maximized or built around, that you would end up with like swingier gameplay than you would get from a cube that is quote-unquote pursuing a more flat power level. And yet, the games we played on stream of the irregular cube were the longest and closest games we have ever played of any cube ever on stream.
Yeah, down to me making a misplay with literally no cards left in library with you at 1 life, and we couldn't figure out how to navigate the situation properly.
I thought it was really interesting that, like, that's how we... And obviously, that's extremely anecdotal, right? We played
For sure
3 matches. That's not going to be representative necessarily, but it was interesting to me that even though we each had really big power outliers in our decks, right? Cards that were substantially better than the average card power level in our decks, it didn't mean that the gameplay was inherently skewed, right? It wasn't like you drew all 3 of yours, or that all 3 of your power outliers worked together. Right? All my power outliers were 5 drops, so drawing
those work together.
Drawing multiple 5 drops is not generally good in the first place because they're 5 drops. You don't really want to have 2 of those in your opening hand. So even though they're power outliers, they don't really play nicely together because you really only want the one. Otherwise, you want cards to survive until you get to cast your 5 drop, even if they're dinky little replaceable glue level cards. So I don't know. I thought it was an interesting observation. How do you feel about the regular cube today?
I mean, I've absolutely just been thinking about it in the back of my mind as we've been talking about this idea of rarities and build-arounds, and I think where I'm at is I'm still really interested in this idea of rarity. That is something that I want to explore more for all of the same reasons that Ryan is explaining of, just having this opportunity for more build-arounds. I think the issue in that environment is that, well, maybe there's just too big of a difference. Some of the cards in there are just way too hard to build around, and so they just end up getting sideboarded. They're just not cards that matter. And some of the cards, like I'm thinking of things like Sun Titan and Frost Titan, aren't really build-arounds outside of the fact that you need to survive until you can cast a 6-drop. And the environment is deliberately structured to have enough aggressive themes that is a real consideration, but it still is a little bit too easy to just put those in a deck and they kind of carry you. So I think that Ryan is in a much more balanced place with this build-around cube, where the rares are committal, but they reward you, and there's always enough glue for them, whereas this experiment in the irregular cube was a first experiment, and it's a little bit too broad currently. But not to say that it hasn't led to a lot of fun gameplay.
You know, I've actually experienced, just to be clear, the build-around cube, while it is great, I have experienced very similar things to what you're describing. Maybe the rare slot is in a bit of a better place. In my current opinion is that it's less about the rares, at least, and it's a lot about the perception. That
Totally, yeah.
And this might be also true about the irregular cube.
Oh, yeah.
But people see a card that, like, normally doesn't work, right? And like, they just don't want to try it. And so
or hear me out, they do try it and it still doesn't work, and then they say they hate the cube and never play it ever again. I'm maybe thinking of a particular drafter that saw, what was it? Was it Wheel of Fortune? I saw something in the irregular cube and they were like, I'm drafting Storm.
Thousand Year Storm? I think it was Thousand Year Storm.
Thousand Year Storm, sure, great.
Yeah.
And they tried to draft a Storm deck and they 0-3'd and they were like, this cube sucks, I hate it. And it's like, well, you know, it's intentionally got a broader range of possible outcomes, and you've experienced one of them.
Yeah, I mean, something else that I've been struggling with that I wonder if you've experienced is there are also some cards that are they're just broken cards. I'm thinking of things like the Conspiracies, like World Knit and Sovereign's Realm, or, you know, things like having Scrollcraft in a low-powered environment, where it's like, it is fun to do it every once in a while, I think, to be like, hey, I've got Sovereign's Realm, I'm going to totally change the way that I'm drafting and build this really extreme kind of deck. But whenever we do that, it seems to not actually be that much fun, and players just get frustrated by losing to those kinds of really extreme build-arounds.
Yeah, I think so. So my opinion of it is, one, all Conspiracies are just way too messed up to just touch. I just, like, they're all so, like, it's just like free. They're like companions on steroids.
Yeah,
that's a good description.
For me, I think one of the things that's bad about them is the way in which they're good is like you get it every game, right? It's guaranteed, and your opponent's over there drawing random hands, like, maybe I'll draw some of my good cards, and you just get it, right? Whereas if you have Black Lotus in your deck, like, sure, am I going to be a little bit bummed or tilted the game that you play a 4-drop on turn 1? Probably, but is that going to happen every game? No. And so there's, like, some more of that variance where, like, you have a chance to steal a game, where it just feels like you're up against Hymn of the Wilds. It's like, well, GG's. Probably have no chance, but I guess we'll play them out, and that feeling is not good.
You know, maybe actually part of our earlier conversation really kind of colors what the issue here is, that I think it's really fun to open Hymn of the Wilds or Sovereign's Realm and draft that deck.
Those are the drafts you should just throw in the bin and never play the games.
The drafts are fun. The games are not necessarily that fun. Like, it is the reevaluation of cards and recontextualizing cards that is the fun experience, but the gameplay is just kind of busted, which, I mean, maybe the better example of that kind of experience is something like the Turbo Cube, where it is very fun to open up a pack and reevaluate all these cards, and then everybody's on the same playing field, so there is some weird sort of rules of engagement stuff to learn, but you're still playing meaningful games, whereas the lopsidedness of the Conspiracy games is really where it breaks apart.
As far as that idea, too, of recontextualizing a draft, I actually think that companions were really cool in Ikoria Limited. And I should specify, this was the very beginning of the pandemic. Everything was locked down. I don't play Arena, so I was just doing sealed pools. But I did a lot of sealed pools of that set. And I thought that companions, while obviously a huge problem in Constructed, and actually, Ryan, I think it's interesting, experience playing with Conspiracies in Cube, I think, made me and other Cube designers much more able to identify just how problematic companions were, whereas some other players were like, well, there's these limitations, and what if you can't play spells that cost more than 2 mana or whatever, and we're all like, no, you don't understand. Sentinel Dispatch is better than Black Lotus. I'm telling you, these are a huge problem, and they just weren't getting it. So anyway, I think that the companions are like an interesting solution to that for Limited specifically. When you have to draft your deck, and you may or may not open a companion that has some moderate value, like nothing compared to a Hymn of the Wilds, but it's still worth it to, you know, play your Karuga or your whatever the odd number one is that doubles damage, the black-red guy. Obosh, thank you. Those cards are definitely worth it if you can build around them, but it's this sort of commensurate reward. Like, when that happened, I was like, man, I kind of wish, I know they're not coming back to this mechanic, and I'm glad they're not for Magic more broadly, but for specifically this style of drafting where all of a sudden the pack is recontextualized. You're like, well, I can't even play some of these cards anymore. These other cards that I can play how can I make them work in this deck, and how do I optimize this weird sort of build around it. I think that's really cool about the companions, actually.
Yeah, and companions are kind of like this perfect sweet spot. Actually, the like first thing that I knew was going to be in the rare slot were the companions for this build around cube. And one of the things I'll say about these rares tied to like some being too good, from what I can see, the issue is kind of about the amount of work. Generally, I don't think people mind like if you do the thing, right? Like if you draft Obosh, which is just if you companion it, absolutely busted. But you companion it, I don't think most people are like pissed off when you like beat them with your Obosh. They're like, wow, you did the thing. But when the thing is just like reading the spell, tapping your mana, and casting it.
Oops, I have Sun Titan now.
Yeah, it doesn't feel as good. So the things that have felt really good as these power outliers in my build around cube are the rares like companions that like when people get there feel awesome and you're clearly playing on another level, but you know what? It took skill and effort to get there. That feels great. And the other ones are like classically powerful cards, but ones that tend to scale with the environment, not just be stupid. I'll give you an example. I think a really good example of this was Survival of the Fittest is actually a rare in my build-around cube. Survival of the Fittest is like an utterly broken Magic card.
Oh, yeah.
But like you're tutoring cards that you have in your deck. So like you're beating people with other cards, not the actual survival, and it has a crazy ceiling of like doing chains with like madness cards that is cool. And so that's like at the higher echelon of the rares in the build around cube. That's like definitely a historically broken card, but when you're playing against it, it doesn't feel the same as like, oh, you had it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a great point, and really is interesting that this idea of having cards that take some amount of investment both makes the draft more dynamic, it makes the games more varied, but it also just makes it better for the opponent. So it really just leads to a lot of better gameplay all around.
It's also like, I gotta say, and maybe this is the cube designer in me talking, but as a player, sometimes I'm kind of bummed if I open up a Sun Titan and I'm in white, and I'm like, well, I had this cool synergistic card, but I'm just supposed to take the Sun Titan, so I guess I'll just take the Sun Titan and pass up this cool card that I otherwise have a deck for, but now I just, if I'm trying to put my player hat on and be objective, I'm just supposed to take the better card, you know?
I feel like we're being a little hard on Sun Titan here. Sun Titan is a pretty cool card.
It's, yeah. I think people have been beaten down by it enough times in the Irregular cube to feel some kind of way about it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I definitely don't have this like negative experience of Sun Titan being a good card, but I also don't think I've ever cast Sun Titan in a cube where it would be, you know, one of the best cards.
I think it sees play in a lot of cubes where it is not that good because people have impressions from other environments and other contexts. But
which, I mean, we've gone a little bit further afield from this, but talking about sort of the idea of designing cubes at lower power levels, I think this is one of the huge advantages that I really enjoy is that you think of Sun Titan as this sort of C- card that, you know, if your white deck ever wants a 6-drop, maybe you'll play if you're used to playing a lot of these high-powered cubes.
If your Reanimator deck is absolutely desperate, and I mean desperate.
But it is fun to put it in a low-power context and be like, let's play a powerful Sun Titan. Let's see what it looks like when this card is really busted. And it leads to a lot of very novel lines of play.
2 hours later, everybody's mad at Sun Titan.
Exactly. Or, you know, another example that I like to bring up is Wheel of Fortune, which, you know, classically plays in, you know, sort of storm decks or other sort of very narrow places. But the idea of just playing it in your fast, aggressive, retail, limited style deck as a way to refill your hand is pretty cool and interesting to recontextualize those classic cards and make them powerful in a different way.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'll say, I actually think this kind of ties a lot together with respect to going back to the flat power level discussion. One of the things that kind of differentiates bad from good to great limited formats, not cube, but limited formats. The best limited formats are not defined by their rares, but your rares let you do different things. Okay, people tend not to like limited formats in which like a lot of the games play like, they cast their rare and I didn't have an answer and I lost. But people also don't like limited formats where all the decks are kind of the same because they're just chock full of commons and no rare that you can really open is going to let you do something different. So there's this really nice balance that happens when you don't have a flat power level by letting decks do different things. Give decks resources, and the great idea of whether or not you use a rare slot in your cube, this applies to any cube of any power level, but definitely more relevant for the lower powered, like cubes, you usually can include one card that can entirely recontextualize multiple archetypes. And I think that's awesome, and it's synonymous to, a quote-unquote rare, even if it's just in your, you have a 360 cube, even if it's just in there. It's a rare in the sense that, there aren't many of them. It'll be in every draft, but it's not going to define what everybody does. It's a thing that someone might do that's cool, and it only costs you one slot. So another thing that I think is really relevant when I'm designing cubes is I call it slot equity. Right? You only have so many cards that you can put in your cube, and so in order to make something, quote unquote, a thing in your cube, the amount of slots you have to dedicate to it matters a lot to me. The less slots that I need to dedicate to something, the more likely I am to put it in there as, a way of giving players agencies to find different perturbations of their archetypes.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, I actually was just going back and rereading a couple days ago to pull a quote. Ari Lax's article on limited design and making good rares. One of the examples that's brought up there that I think is great is the Weatherlight in Dominaria, which was just there were a lot of C- artifact cards that you wouldn't normally put in your deck, but if you opened up this one cool mythic, it would just change the way you would draft a little bit, and suddenly you'd be really interested in finding things that could specifically crew the Weatherlight or artifacts that you could fetch off of it. And a lot of games you wouldn't necessarily draw that one card that change the way you drafted, but it means that those games are still different games than what you would have if you didn't have that little kick, the little nudge to draft your deck differently around this one individual card. And counterpoint to that, he mentions Ethereal Absolution, which just you always play in your deck all the time, and it always does the same thing and ruins the games as a really terrible terrible rare for limited.
That's exactly right.
So we've talked a lot about the range of what YouTube would describe as limited cubes. What are some examples of cubes that are not limited cubes? How do you look at a cube list and know, okay, this is not what you would describe as a limited cube?
I mean, maybe I should just say that, even though I love limited, and definitely that informs the way that I design a lot of the cubes that I really enjoy and want to play the most, I think that is a little bit of a misnomer as well, because there are a lot of things about my primary cube that are not like limited design. We talked a little bit about the differences between the way they design commons and uncommons and rares, and there are a lot more cards in my cube that are at that rare power level. There are multiple wraths, things like that. So for me, I feel like the reason that I sort of reach for that limited name is kind of for the worst reasons that we've talked about, but just it's an easy way to communicate to people that this is going to be a lower powered cube, and people have some expectations, and when there are a couple extra more powerful cards than they expected, they see that as upside. Whereas if I just try and describe it as, well, these are lower powered cards.
It's never good to start off describing your cube as a low, just don't start off with the word low. That's just that's a word people have negative associations with.
I really do struggle to describe my main cube, and we've talked about that issue before, and I just saw on Reddit somebody else posted, here's my new lower powered cube, and I see okay, well, you got all the classic low powered cards in here. You got Solitude, you got Jace the Mind Sculptor, you got Umezawa's Jite. It's okay, maybe the bottom 20% is much lower than a normal vintage cube, but
you're not playing that 20% anyway.
Exactly. So yeah, I don't know. It is difficult to describe them. So that's one of the reasons that I sort of latched onto this after a long time of calling it a limited style cube, because it was something that wasn't seen as a negative that people could latch onto. But to many skilled players, we had this issue a little bit in the Rotisserie draft where people were saying, well, these don't really make sense in a limited style cube. And that's true. And that's because this is more descriptive than prescriptive term for my cube.
So that's a pretty fancy way to get around the question of what's not a limited cube.
Yes.
I think I can think of it in a pretty straightforward way that I think Anthony's going to agree with. When I think about, the types of cubes that I enjoy designing, I used to really love and push the power level to the maximum. If people know, my constructed cube that was, the most, basically, you draft, you draft a card, you get 4 of it, and you could basically draft any card ever. So you could just draft the most busted decks you could possibly imagine. But now I've been way more on this kick on, what we're calling, these lower power limited cubes. And I always start from the same place. And that place is kind of Masters Set limited is actually the way that I would describe it. It's usually way, way, way more powerful and way more synergistic than your average retail set. And I would say that when I'm looking to design a cube, right, I want the average power level of a deck in this quote-unquote limited space, the average power level of a deck in this cube to be reminiscent of a good deck in a Masters limited format. Now, there's a natural distribution around that, so you could go all the way to the left where you're talking more retail limited kind of power, and you're going to the right where you're like not in this like modern cube, legacy cube, vintage cube area, but you are more powerful than any actual limited experience from packs is going to normally give you. So for me, when I say limited style cubes, it has two components. One is actual power level. If you look at an average draft deck from this cube, that tends to line on a power level of a good deck in some limited format. That's one. And two, that it's very purposefully not a flat power level, right? That there is purposeful, distribution that says like there's a chunk of this that are kind of like the commons, and then there are these power outliers, but they're not, ethereal absolution busted. So those are the two main qualities that I think would describe a limited cube. And if you're missing either one of those two, I probably wouldn't describe the cube in that way.
Do you agree, Anthony?
I do agree. And again, like I'll say from my main cube, I do think I'd be curious about your opinion on this, Ryan, but I do think I have a relatively flat power level, and at least the things that are higher power do still take some investment. So I don't know if I totally fall into that
Lingering
that space.
Souls has entered the chat.
Hello, Lingering Souls.
So
nice to see you, old friend.
To me, flat power level doesn't mean that you're playing bad cards or you're playing good cards, right? It just means that like there's and it's not saying like you have a wider, like if you gave the example like when you're talking about vintage cube, there's cards like Black Lotus and Oko. Obviously, there's a wide power disparity between those two, between whatever your worst card is in that cube and that card. But you can still be purposefully trying to design your cube, right, where everything is at like a particular power level. And I think, to me, why the regular cube and why this build-around cube very purposefully we don't have that is there are purposeful decisions to say, hey, I know this card is outside the band of what this cube does, and I'm purposefully adding it because I think it adds something great and unique to the experience. And if you were to add 20 more cards that were like that into your cube, your entire cube experience would change.
Yeah, that's your Feathers and your Dreadhorde Arcanist, where it's like,
Sure, exactly.
Dreadhorde Arcanist is an absolutely f***ed up magic card, and in your environment, you have Gird for Battle, which is f***ed up with Dreadhorde Arcanist, right? Or you have Domri's Ambush. So, like, the ceiling on those cards is higher than even the ceilings in some of the best cards in my much more powerful cube, but it fits there because, like Ryan's saying, it has this purpose to be there, and it does change your evaluation of cards when you're looking in packs, and you start looking for things that boost power because you have this other advantage that's not just a combat trick for them.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah. And maybe I need to like rework it in my head a little bit because you could probably win an argument with me and say, well, that applies to powered cube because of power.
It is a tough descriptor, right? And that's why I asked, like, what wasn't a limited cube? And this idea of a flat power level, I feel like we could record an entire episode now. We could just, like, stop this episode, end here, start a new episode with Ryan about flat power level, because I agree that I think the people describe cube as having a flat power level, and what they mean is it's just flat relative to retail limited, as in there aren't going to be any Fs in these packs, and there aren't going to be any Glorybringers or Tetsamoks and how they played in their actual retail limited sets where, like, you're just going to lose because your opponent opened a card that you can't beat. And
yeah, maybe a better... sorry to interrupt you, but...
Oh, I should be interrupted more, to be honest.
I think instead of talking about flat power level, not flat power level, right, what if a better way to describe it might be when you look at a deck, right? When you look at a good deck drafted in the cube, that deck itself has like a reasonable distribution of cards, right? Like the thing that separates like a pauper cube, the best decks in that, like all the cards do the same thing. And in limited, you don't see decks where it's like, look, this deck has all the same card. All of these play the same role. They're kind of similar in what they do, same level. And that's where this flat power level kind of came from in my head, was, well, like, you want to differentiate these quote-unquote lower-powered cubes from the lower-powered experience that people know, which is usually stuff like Pauper. And there's a very big difference between the experience of a Pauper cube or a Peasant cube or or a set cube, and these experiences that are kind of trying to be reminiscent of limited. And that's more so that like the power is in line with some limited format. Like you look at a deck and you could feel like, hey, I drafted this in Dominaria Remastered, or I drafted this in, you know, something that isn't necessarily a cube. The other side of that is that like when you look at a deck in limited, you usually see a distribution of cards of different powers. But maybe you can have a cube where it's, you know, 80 to 90% quote unquote, you know, maybe like 80% quote unquote flat power. And it feels like, okay, you've brought up the base. You've brought up the lowest level cards so people aren't playing with dregs.
No more Hedron alignment.
Right, but
okay, well.
but that 20% can still do so much work in making the decks function over a distribution of different power levels to make it feel more like limited than you would get from a cube that doesn't purposefully do that.
I think it's a great way to describe it.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
To me, it's like there's this graph in my head. I'm a visual person. I can always see everything visually, where it's like if you look at the disparity between the best and worst cards, right? At one extreme, where you have like crazy bombs and absolute unplayable garbage, like the draft loses a lot of its interest, right? Because you just take the bombs, and then once you have bombs in a certain combination of colors, you just take the cards in those colors because that's where your bombs are, and you want to play a deck where you can cast all your spells. And then if you imagine the other extreme, and I have played cubes that have really pursued a flat power level as close as possible, I think the draft also completely erodes on that end too. And it's like, okay, great. I've got a pack in front of me. None of these cards is more interesting or better than any other card. It feels like I can just literally take whatever I want, and I could just force any deck I want, and it would just work because there's no risk, there's no tension anymore. It's just every card is good, every card's playable, just put it in my deck and it'll be fine.
And I think that has huge ramifications on the way the entire draft feels, because it's really hard to read signals when everybody's just taking the best card of the pack, and that's subtle differences when somebody doesn't say, well, I took this one power outlier that is exciting and I'm going to now move into this color and start sending a signal. So it really impacts the whole experience.
Something I have noticed, which I think is true in almost all cubes, especially higher power level cubes, is that everybody, really good players that I've watched on stream, and, you know, less experienced players that I've, you know, picked up their decks after they've drafted my cube at, you know, our cube night, they get married to their first pick. Nobody's drafting the hard way. Nobody is saying what's open by the time we get to picks 4 through 6. They're just like, yeah, I've got these cards early, I'm going to play them no matter what. And you generally just can, because even if the people passing you are taking those colors, the third and fourth best cards in that pack are still playable because the power level's flat enough that you can still just draft a functional deck, even if you're essentially being cut on all sides. And sure, maybe it's not the greatest deck. Maybe you end up in the 1-2 bracket or whatever, but that's an attribute of so many cubes, I think, that I don't think is a healthy attribute of them necessarily. That, like, I think a lot of cube designers are really hyper-focused on making sure their players don't train wreck, right? They don't want their players to end up with, like, a completely unplayable deck, because we all agree that's not fun. But when you overcommit to that, it's like, is it even possible to do, like, bad anymore? Like, if you made it so the floor is so high that if you just like pick 2 colors and draft a curve, that everything's going to be fine. And that's where I think this idea of much more committal, much more interesting build arounds, changing that direction of the draft really starts to come into play, where it's like, it's not a matter of is my color open or whatever. It's like, oh, I saw this card 4th pick that is just so much better than anything else if I can build around it, that I'm going to actually try and do that now.
You've been tracking a bunch of information about all the cube games you played. Did you play your first pick, a metric you've been tracking?
I have not been tracking that.
Interesting. Or not interesting. It might be interesting if you did.
I mean, definitely most of the time, yeah, for sure. I would say probably 3/4 of the time, and I think I abandon my first pick way more than the average person does.
That was
playing
the number I was going to give too.
Yeah, I am willing to jump. I mean, honestly, sometimes I feel like I do it because I want it to be the right thing to do, even though I think maybe it's not. Like, I'll be like, look, it's pick 5, green seems open. I'm going to abandon my first 4 picks because I want it to be true that if I were to abandon those first 4 picks at this point, that I would get sufficiently rewarded. But in reality, getting past all those green cards that are the tippy top of green, are they that much better than the, you know, bottom third of whatever blue-red cards I had? And in a lot of cubes, no, it's not that much different. So you actually don't get rewarded for drafting the open lane.
Yeah, true.
Because you lost 4 of your best picks in order to hopefully get rewarded down the lane, and you just don't, because the dregs of the blue-red cards would have been fine in your deck too, and you would have had your first 4 picks to work with. So that's something I want to make less of a thing in my own cube. I want people to feel like they are rewarded for drafting the hard way, as it were, and jumping out of a lane and trying to find what's open, which right now I don't think that's as much of a factor. Like, I think the bombs you open kind of dictate the direction you start going, and I don't aim for a flat power level. I specifically do aim for having power outliers, not in the kind of way you're describing. I don't have it broken up into like glue and non-glue, but I definitely am conscious of the cards that I think are the best cards in my cube and the direction in which they pull people. But it definitely feels like, okay, well, the 3 people passing me could all be in red, and I could still draft a deck that has red in it and be okay, which, not great. I want, because I think it does take away something dynamic about the idea of drafting.
Yeah, there's a really interesting push and pull, and I don't know if you guys know this. I'm actually, one of the things that I, as like a limited content creator, when I was playing a ton and writing a ton, said a lot, is that people stay open too much. There's too much of a focus on trying to, as you put it, draft the hard way, find the open lane. And that's not to say that it's not important to, but the example that you said is actually a great example of this. Green might be open, but that doesn't mean that your best deck, your best avenue of drafting is going to be a green deck. In the scenario that you said, it doesn't matter. You just shouldn't be drafting green because it's not going to lead to a better deck. At the end of the day, I said this earlier in the podcast, but when you draft, your pool contains all of the cards that you have, and it also contains all of the, like, a probability distribution describing the cards that you expect to see. Now, why drafting open is a good thing is because when you see green cards like that, now your pool effectively already contains a large density of them, because you think there is a high probability that you're going to get good, you're going to have the opportunity to take good green cards. But that doesn't mean you're supposed to draft green. It just means you ask yourself the question, assuming I have the opportunity to take these good green cards, is that better than what I'm currently doing? Or is that better than something else that I currently have the opportunity to do? I think it is important for your drafters to be able to ask those questions and choose to pivot or not. But I don't think that you actually need to have any sort of focus on, I need to make it such that 3 red drafters can't exist in a row, to force people to try and pivot into what's open, because you also don't want to kind of squeeze someone. I'll give you an example. I absolutely despise the black-white life gain archetype. Absolutely, like, one of my least favorite things.
Speak on it, Ryan. I don't know where this is going, but I'm tenuously excited.
Andy's grinning like an idiot.
The only times that I ever end up drafting it is if I feel forced to, because it is so open and I am pushed to do it, because it is just it's not only the best thing that I can do, I don't see myself having other avenues. And I think that most good cube design, that wouldn't even be possible. It wouldn't be possible to sit at any seat and feel forced down a particular path because it's open.
So you're just saying you don't like piloting a black-white life gain deck, not from a like broad design perspective. You don't like what the deck
that's
does
correct.
To an environment.
I just hate the way the games play. There have been many times in limited formats where I draft a black-white life gain deck, I play a game and I concede and go to the next draft. Like, I just drop. Because it's like life equity. It's going to take me 2 hours to push through those games anyways. I don't need the tickets. It's not going to be a fun experience for me. My time is better spent just drafting.
It's like the Commander game we just played before recording this podcast, where you just handed the life counter to the person playing the black-white life gain deck and said, you manage this now.
Yeah. We also, had a good moment where we're just like, you know what? We're not dead, but we're conceding. This is not fun anymore.
That one might have been my fault.
So we're just going to walk away from this. And, yeah, the life equity is always a good recentering, I think, when involved in these sorts of things.
Oh, the only thing that I guess I'd say that we didn't talk about is I personally, and maybe this is just because I have so many heuristics built in my head, I find designing these types of cubes way harder.
That was going to be one of my
harder.
questions for you, is because you mentioned earlier that you love Cube because you love drafting, right? Drafting is one of your like big loves in the game. And I think it's very evident from your Twitter presence, for example, where I would say most days you post multiple pack one pick ones from whatever cube you're working on, and you're asking people, pack one pick one's not a good way to put it, because you're asking people, what's the card here to win? What's the card here to have fun? What card, you think is a trap or whatever? You ask like detailed questions about this stuff. And sometimes I feel like you're designing the cube because it's fun to design the cube. It's fun to like get in the weeds and figure out how to like tune this environment in the way you're looking for, and getting all that feedback about people that relates specifically to design for the draft, right? Like you're asking people questions that they're going to be asking themselves during the draft, because that's what you're making card choices about largely. I mean, obviously the games you draft because of the games, but I think a lot of cube designers, when they picture their environment, they're just picturing decks. They're like, I want this deck to be good, put cards in, make that deck good. They're not picturing a pack and the decision they want their player to be making when they're looking at that pack.
Yeah, I also think like I'm a big fan of the like concept that restrictions breed creativity, but like beyond that like looking at things from different lenses is really helpful. And when I design a cube, they're like from the ground up, there's a few things that I think about. So one, I definitely don't think about decks. I don't think about archetypes at all at the beginning. I think about it more like I'm designing like a block constructed metagame. Right? Like I'm giving players tools to build decks. And that is my purpose as a designer. I will give them a bunch of ways to build decks, but one of the most awesome things that happens as a cube designer is when someone does something that you didn't expect. And I want to create environments where that's possible, because I've given players so many tools to build decks that they got to put a hammer and a nail together I didn't see, that I didn't intend. I think that's awesome. And reformatting the way that you think about things a little bit away from archetypes, away from decks, and towards like a more broad notion of giving those players different tools, I think is really helpful. The other thing, and I think you've actually mentioned this on the podcast before when I was listening to an episode, and I remembered it kind of rung true for me. When you think about it that way, the only thing that I change from this idea of block constructed when I'm thinking about a cube is I also, and this comes from my experience in Limited a lot, overlap is really important to me. Once you start branching out of like what different decks can be or are doing, the like things that are close to those becomes really important, because I think an easy way for a cube to devolve into an unpleasant drafting experience, something that people would call as on rails, is if most cards only accomplish one goal or only go in one place. I think I have a few goals as a designer, and one of those is that like every single card should have at least two different things that it can do, right? That it should go in two different places. And whatever the worst card in my cube is, it should be able to be the best card in some deck. And I find as long as those two things are true, it usually leads to like a really nice and positive draft experience.
That second one sounds ambitious.
It's hard. It's really hard. But I focus a lot on the bottom level of my cube usually when I'm really tuning. I really dislike synergistic payoffs that are middle of like medium in your synergistic decks. I think I was looking at a cube recently, like I think there's a card that's like a 2-mana 0/3, when it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter, and like creatures you control with +1/+1 counters have trample.
So
and like
Dusk Shell Beetle, maybe?
Yeah,
You
something.
sicko.
I don't think it's a
absolute
beetle.
pervert. You knew that card.
Dusk Shell sounded right. I'm not sure about beetle, but the problem that I have with that card is in most places, right? In most green decks, it doesn't seem like something I'd even want to consider. And let's say I'm in the +1/+1 counter deck, the one deck that really does want to consider that card.
You're not even excited about it.
I'm not. Yeah, exactly. Like, it's fine. It's probably not my worst card, but I'm not convinced it's going to be in the top half. And those cards I don't want in my cubes. That's my personal design philosophy. But like for me, if I'm including a card that goes in a low percentage of decks, right, that is there for synergistic components, it should be one of the better cards in that deck. That's another reason why, like, there are all of those, like, there are a lot of people who've said, like, oh, one of the things that I track to make sure that I cut the right cards is what cards are going last. What cards are in sideboards more often. And for me, if I'm doing a really great job designing at least the cubes that I want to design,
some of the best cards will be
cards
there.
That are going, exactly. The suite of cards that are going last and are in sideboards are there because there are hundreds of different decks that you can draft in my cube, and there are only 8 people drafting it. Which means there are a bunch of different decks that no one's drafting, way more than are drafting. And some cards are for those decks and not for one that is for those 8 people at the table. And it's fine for them to go last. And if one particular deck is only drafted 1 in 3, 1 in 4, maybe even 1 in 5 times, that card's going to always go last. And it better be one of their best cards if I'm justifying putting it at my cube.
Yeah, that one of those 5 times, it better carry the day, right? It's got to be like the most exciting, interesting, powerful thing that you could be doing when you do draft that deck. Otherwise, it's maybe not worth riding those sideboards for all the rest of the drafts.
Exactly.
Love that attitude. This was great, Ryan. Thank you for coming on. This is exactly what I wanted to talk about with you, and I think it, I don't know, I think I learned a lot from this episode, and I'm on the podcast, so that's a good sign, I think.
I'm glad. No, it was super fun. I mean, I don't make much Magic content anymore. I've definitely like missed being on the 540 when I did that for a while. So it's nice to like be able to talk about Cube, you know?
I was going to say, is there any specific thing you want to promote? Like, I know you're not making a ton of content right now. Is there anywhere you want to point people?
The card Orcish Lumberjack.
There you go.
Put it in your cube.
Everybody.
That's what I want to do.
Talk about a card that gives you a lot of opportunity and asks a lot of you. Orcish Lumberjack. That's the one.
That one. I have very, very fond memories of playing that card on turn 1, staring at my opponent, having them stare at me. And
watch me have no lands and kill you. Just watch me have no lands and kill you.
I'm pretty active on Twitter, if you want to share that. My Twitter handle is @RC and I do post a lot about Cube and Magic. A lot of the questions that I ask are kind of about like different perceptions of different cards. I'm really interested at the moment in like building nostalgia focused cubes and trying to like build a cube that would make people that have played the game for a long time smile. And so, yeah, I mean, people can follow me, but I don't really make Magic content anymore. I've written like 400 something articles for StarCityGames.com, but I haven't written for them for about a year now.
Find Ryan on Twitter and put Orcish Lumberjack in your cubes. Everyone's required to do it.
Easy call to action.
I expect to be able to check Cube Map archives and see a big spike in the play of Orcish Lumberjack around the date of this podcast coming out. So get on it, listeners. Yeah. And that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. The show is produced by Anthony and I calling up Ryan and just talking about Cube for an hour and a half. Thanks again, Ryan. This was great.
Yeah, I had a blast. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. What are we going to talk about next time? I'm just thinking about like graph theory a little bit based on like every card going into multiple decks, and I'm thinking about the dreaded on rails. We got like 10 clusters of cards and this other network.
This is what is
all
in my head
together.
whenever I'm working on a cube.
Graph theory.
Well, is that what it's called?
That's what it's called.
I visualize everything, and yeah, that's how my head works.
I think one of the things to say. So I'm actually pretty passionate about. So my favorite field of math is topology. I don't know if either.
I know nothing about topology, but I am.
It's easiest to love something. It's easiest to love something you know very little about, because when you learn a lot about something, a lot of times it loses its luster.
I love looking at a mug and saying that has one hole in it.
Yeah, it's the old one hole mug.
This mug is a donut.
Exactly.
There is no difference. There is no difference between this mug and a donut. That is topology. I mean, topology is the like study of like mathematical surfaces, but it's really almost about like reformatting the way that you think about an abstract space. So the cube map, right? When you're doing this dimensionality reduction and visualizing something in a space where that space is defined by the distance between cubes, what you're actually creating is called a metric space. And that's what topology is, the actual math field of studying those things. So this idea that you have some like visual graph in your head of how things are close to each other and far away and all of that. I actually think like topology is like a really nice way of thinking about it. And so I'm actually, from like a technical side of things, very passionate about what's called representation learning, which is the task of how do you take a concept and project it into a vector or numbers so that you can do math with that, compute distances with that. And I'm very interested, actually, something that we can talk about another time is the intersection of the cube map actually with, right now you're doing I think I was talking to Parker about this. I think it's some form of UMap, right, to project into this space that you visualize. I'm actually very interested at taking that same concept. Can you actually have different algorithms that work based on projecting cubes to a vector space or some topological space? And you can run UMap on that and see, how does that change the cube map? Is something that has been in my head for a very long time. But I also think in the way that you were describing, Andy, and I would use the word topology before I would use graph theory, and I could talk about it for very long time.
All right, maybe next time we got to have Jet on the show as well, and we can do just a full math episode.
I'll happily bow out of that one because I'll be out of my depth. I'm going to go Google topology and learn more about it. Yeah, maybe we have a similar brain, Ryan, but what I did with my brain is I went to painting school with it. So, different directions in life. But I do have one question, though, just related to all that technical stuff. How many holes does the cube map have then?
The cube map doesn't really have holes. It's more of just Ryan.
I mean, it could have holes. I'd have to study the surface.
It doesn't necessarily have solid space or surfaces. It's more of just a cluster of points.
Good improv, guys. Way to run with the bit. This is good.
How many holes does a t-shirt have?
That they're part of. You may have individual cubes, right? But those cubes are actually like there's an infinitely many number of cubes that you can describe, right? Like there's that parameter space, and that parameter space actually describes a surface. You have different points on the surface, but there is a whole surface there.
Right. The whole surface is just a 25,000 dimensional hypercube. What's the abstract word for a cube of n dimensions?
It might be hypercube. I don't know. But I've genuinely no clue. What I would like to say to end this is I would love to live in a world where the cube map is a donut. That would be great.
Well, you've heard it here, folks. We don't know how many holes the cube map has, so I guess comment below how many holes you think the cube map has.